The bass guitar was invented in 1951 as a way of problem solving the low volume of a double bass. You simply couldn't hear it and as the dance band got bigger, more brass, more drums, more guitars, the double bass player simply couldn't be heard anymore. The answer was to come up with something that you could plug into a speaker, and that's what this is. So-called precision bass, which was the first one, it's got frets on it, hence the name precision. Whereas the double bass is fretless. So it's much more difficult to play the double bass, and indeed the bass guitar enabled guitarists to learn how to play the bass as well. So it was all round a very useful bit of kit. So how do we get started with this then? What do we need to think about? What habits do we need to get into? Let's take a look. So there are some good habits to get into when you're playing the bass, and you can get started really quite quickly because the bass player's job is quite simple. Simple in terms of sort of musical content, but actually that comes with its own sort of set of problems, namely consistency and rhythmic sort of purity. Now, if we just start with the right hand, basically if you put your arm on the top of the bass and let your wrist flop down towards the strings, essentially you've got really the right sort of angle there. Now, when you're playing the strings themselves, avoid plucking them underneath like this, because you get sort of an inconsistent noise and you get those sort of slappy things. Likewise, if you hit the strings from above, you get a similar problem. What we need is to have both of your fingers, now this is index finger and middle finger, make them alternate however slowly you play, because it gets you used to being able to use two fingers to pluck with. That's really important because when you play faster, it becomes really hard if you just use one finger. So I'm just going to play the open A string, which is the third one from the bottom. The strings are numbered 1 here and 4 this end. So if I've just got my open A string, notice that my thumb is sat on the 4th string. The reason for that is if I pluck the A string, I might accidentally strike the 4th string, and I don't want that. I want to be able to just play the A string. Every time you pluck a string on the bass, you come to rest on the string above it, as it were. Notice, obviously, if you're playing the bottom string, then your fingers would come to rest maybe on the pickup here or somewhere else on the body. So, going back to the open A string, I'm playing over the pickup at the moment. If I play towards the neck, I get a little bit less mid-range and more bass. If I play over here, the opposite is true. I get more mid and less bass. So a good compromise is kind of halfway between the end of the fingerboard and the bridge. In this sort of precision bass, that's where the pickup is. Aim for consistency in volume and tone out of both of your fingers, because that's really important. You can vary it later. You can do this sort of thing. Make one note louder than the other, but to aim for consistency means that you get to control both of your fingers so that they can essentially do equal things. Now I've got GarageBand here just playing a very basic drum rhythm. What you can do is you can start by playing one note every 2 beats, for example. So if we just listen to the beat for the moment, basically counting 1, 2, 3, 4, on 1 and 3 I'm going to put a note. Many people would think, well, that's easy, but actually it's really hard to get the consistency of tone and to make sure that your notes start exactly in time with the drums. So there's a lot to do here. I know it's just a single note that you're just repeating, but actually it's really important that the rhythm and the tone are really consistent. I'm going to play along with the drum beat again, and I'm going to play a note every 2 beats, then I'm going to play a note every beat, then I'm going to play 2 notes per beat, and then 4 notes per beat. This is good practice to do this over a drum rhythm. So here we go with a note every 2 beats first. Now, I played notes that were their full length, so for example, there was always sound there, but when I came back off those 16ths, which initially were a little bit dodgy, you can play notes that are short. Now, in order to stop a note, you could actually, once you played with the middle finger, for example, you can silence it with the other finger, which itself is then ready to play its note, and then vice versa. I can also mute with my left hand, like that. So just moving over to the left hand now, we're just going to just look at this, and then we can start to play different notes over that same drum rhythm. Always minimise your contact with the neck. Don't grab it like that and have your hand wrap round it like this. What we need to do is to move our thumb round about halfway down the neck, halfway across the underside of the neck, which means that you can reach all of your fingers wherever you want to play. So there's a nice load of free space under here, so you can sort of hold a dry white board marker or something under here. It's important to have the freedom so that you're not glued to the neck of the bass. So if I play the 5th fret, so you can see the end of the neck there. If I play the 5th fret on the 4th string, I get the same note as the next string but open. Notice the difference in tone. There's quite a big difference there. The open strings are quite obvious, so it's a good idea to try and avoid them in normal use if you possibly can. Of course, the open E string is the lowest string on the bass guitar. There's no other way of playing that, so you'd have to use that. But generally speaking, if you use fingered notes, they sound a bit more consistent. There's a massive difference there. So if I put my index finger on 5th fret, notice that I put my finger just behind the fret here, not here. Because this fret space, because it's a fretted instrument, essentially you're going to get the same note wherever you play inside that space. But as you come down towards the previous fret, you have to apply a load more pressure so that this string actually touches the fret. The physics of it is that this string and this fret must be completely connected in order for the note to work. If I don't put enough pressure down, it just buzzes against the fret. More so if I move to this end of the fret space. So as I said before, you need to have space under here, so that means that you can reach other notes without having to moving your hand like this. So if I want, for example, an A and then a C, I could use my last finger on 8th fret. With your hand in one position, you can get all of the natural notes that you need from A to G, which is the musical alphabet. You can get an A, a B, a C, D, E, F, G, and A, which is where you started but an octave up this time. So there's 7 different notes, although the scale will have technically 8 notes in. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. So that means that you can play any natural note that you see on a page. If somebody says play an F, you go, oh yeah, it's there. There are other Fs on the bass, of course, but essentially in any of these positions you can get all of your natural notes. Now sharps and flats, that's essentially changing by 1 fret. A sharp means 1 fret this way, a flat means 1 fret the other way. So if I had an A, that would be an A flat, and that would be an A sharp. So you have 1 fret either side of A. You've got A, A flat, and then A sharp. Now, confusingly, and there are historical reasons for this, but you have the sharps and flats can be called two different things. A flat here can be called G sharp because G is here, and I've just raised my note by 1 fret. A flat is the same as G sharp. Now on bass, the most common notes you'll be using are called or termed the root and the fifth. Now for any given note on a string, that's the root, and then the fifth is 2 frets up on the next string. So I go back to my drum rhythm. Now I was using a combination of different sort of note values there. I was going dun, dee dee, do do, do do, but it's all based on the rhythmic delineation of that drum rhythm. That the hi-hats were playing eighth notes. They were keeping a sort of ruler, keeping that sort of eighth note going, and then you can resolve your notes onto any of those eighths, or indeed between them if you're working with sixteenths. You can use, of course, you don't need to play eighths, you could play quarter notes or even halves or whole notes, so you have 1 note per bar. Not very exciting, unfortunately. So you have a root and a fifth, and also the octave above the initial note, so it's another root note. So you can generate a bass line that just has a bit more interest just based on 1 note. Now that works for both major and minor chords. So if you can play that, you could use 2 separate fingers on the 2nd and 3rd strings if you wanted. Or flatten the finger to get that other note. It's important to work with all of your fingers in your left hand. You want the position so that you're not having to sort of or stretch and always use your last finger where appropriate as well, because it develops the strength. Don't worry about all these sort of things that strengthen your fingers. Actually, it's more hassle than it's worth, because there's all the strength you need for playing a string or fretted instrument comes from your hand position. It comes from the fact that you are squeezing with your thumb and forefinger. Now you have various scales. If we've got a minor scale, for example, we can use something called the minor pentatonic, which goes here, then last finger on that same string, and then index finger on the next string, annular finger on the same string, and then index and annular again. With the last finger you can straighten it slightly with the index finger as well, and then your other 2 fingers can curve in order to find their notes, because obviously your middle finger and annular finger are going to be longer than your other 2 fingers when you're approaching the bass. So now you don't want to get too complicated here. Something like this, if I was just jamming on A minor, which would be for this the minor pentatonic, that sort of thing would be preferable to this. So we listen to that particular drum riff there. This is a cross stick, it's quite gentle. Sure, if the drums were more complicated, you could do other things with your minor pentatonic. If I, for example, made the hi-hats a little bit more complicated and slightly louder overall, we'd have this. So the drums being more complicated now may indeed warrant a little bit more on the bass, because you and the drummer are working together. However, if the drummer is playing more complicated, no need for you to. Indeed, it might work better with a simpler bass line over those more complicated drums. Now, if we're playing over a major chord, notice how we had a shape that started with your index finger, and this is on the note A. So that's A minor. That means that for any other key, if we had B minor, I'd just start here instead. And C minor. Notice B and C are together. If you visualise a piano keyboard, there's no black note between B and C. That's why they're next to each other on the neck here. So, going back to A, if we have an A major chord now, we want to do something slightly different with our bass line. This time starting on middle finger, and then last finger on the same string, first finger on the next string, but notice it's back a fret, and then last finger, and then the same on the second string. So we end up with this. And that's called the A major pentatonic. The other one we had was the A minor pentatonic. Now this really does give you masses of possibilities. Don't worry about being able to play a hyperlocrian scale, nothing like that. Really, bass playing involves making something of that chord. You are basically doing something between tonal or notes and the rhythm. You are the link between the drummer and the rest of the band, so that you're working with the drummer, but you're conveying the harmony or the melody as well. So in A major we'd have this. So actually that was the riff for My Girl, My Girl. So that's built completely on the major pentatonic. So wherever you are on the neck, and notice that the scales here were 3 strings. That was basically used for the scale we had. So I didn't use the first string as it was, the G, the thinnest. But if I want to go to D, which is second, so second string down, or the third string, they're numbered from 1 down here to 4 up here. The pattern is the same, so in A and then in D. That works for the minor as well. If we have A minor, and then we can go to D minor, like that. Now, when you're on the thinner strings here, the first and second string, with your right hand, what you can do is you can put your thumb on the A string this time, and actually the top of your finger on the E string, so that actually you've completely muted the third and the fourth strings. So if you're doing something like that, if I didn't do that, you can hear that the other strings have actually started to vibrate. And if you're using any sort of gain or distortion pedal, that effect is going to get more noticeable. So you'll end up with these overtones everywhere. Anyway, there it is. There's a little bit about starting the bass. Keep it simple, work with the drummer. As always, all musicians will play for the song, whether it be words or a top line, anything like that. So keep things sort of under wraps and subtle, because those are the best ways to do things.